October 25, 1944. Philippine Sea, east of Samar Island. The radio crackled to life aboard USS Fanshawe Bay as Ensign William Brooks transmitted words that would make every man in Task Unit 77.4.3 question whether the next hour would be their last. "Those are not our ships. I can see pagoda masts. I see the biggest meatball flag on the biggest battleship I ever saw." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. From his vantage point at 1,500 feet, flying a Grumman TBF Avenger on what should have been a routine anti-submarine patrol, Brooks had just spotted something that contradicted every assumption about where the Japanese fleet was supposed to be. Rising from the horizon in the dim light of early morning came the distinctive silhouettes of heavy cruisers and battleships, steaming at full speed directly towards 6 small escort carriers that possessed nothing capable of stopping them. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding officer of Task Unit 77.4.3, had been assured the powerful Third Fleet protected his northern flank. The San Bernardino Strait was supposedly blocked by American battleships. Yet here, materializing out of the morning haze at 6:37, came 4 battleships, including Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Against this armada stood 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The mathematics of naval warfare were being rewritten not in tactical manuals, but in decisions that would have to be made in the next 60 seconds. What the Imperial Japanese Navy expected was a rout. What they encountered instead would become one of the most extraordinary reversals in naval history, when destroyers barely 1/10 the size of Japanese battleships charged directly, guns that could obliterate them with a single salvo. The impossible was about to occur, and the response would shatter every doctrine the Japanese Navy had been taught about how weaker forces were supposed to behave when confronted by overwhelming strength. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The road to this moment began months earlier, as American forces advanced relentlessly across the Pacific. By October 1944, the liberation of the Philippines had become strategically inevitable. American forces invaded Leyte Island on October 20th, threatening to cut Japan's access to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies and the rubber plantations of Southeast Asia. Without those resources flowing northward, the Japanese Empire's war machine would strangle within months. The Imperial Japanese Navy understood this existential threat. They devised Operation Shogo 1, Victory Operation 1, a complex 3-pronged attack designed to destroy the American invasion fleet anchored in Leyte Gulf. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa would lead the northern force southward from Japan. His force consisted of 4 aircraft carriers, but these flat tops were shells of their former power. The carriers Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda embarked barely 100 aircraft total, with pilots so inexperienced that many could barely land on carriers. This force existed solely as bait to lure Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from Leyte Gulf. Ozawa understood his mission was sacrificial. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura would bring the southern force northward through Surigao Strait. His battleships Yamashiro and Fuso, heavy cruiser Mogami, and 4 destroyers would strike from below, and Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita would command the center force, the most powerful element, through the San Bernardino Strait to strike directly at the vulnerable transport ships in Leyte Gulf. The center force represented the cream of what remained of Japanese naval power after 3 years of attrition warfare. The super battleship Yamato displaced 72,800 tons and carried 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval guns ever mounted on a warship. Each gun could fire a 3,220-pound armor-piercing shell over 26 miles with devastating accuracy. Her sister ship Musashi sailed alongside, an identical floating fortress. Battleships Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna added their 14-inch and 16-inch guns to the formation. 10 heavy cruisers provided devastating mid-range firepower. Each mounted 8 or 10 8-inch guns capable of destroying any American ship smaller than a battleship. Light cruisers Noshiro and Yahagi screened the formation with rapid-fire 6-inch batteries. 11 destroyers completed the force. On paper, Operation Shogo 1 appeared brilliant, but American submarines had already begun its unraveling before the plan fully deployed. On October 23rd, submarines USS Data and USS Dace patrolled the Palawan Passage west of the Philippines when their sonar operators detected Kurita's force transiting toward Leyte. At dawn, they struck. As torpedoes slammed into heavy cruiser Atago, Kurita's flagship. The massive explosions tore the cruiser apart. Atago sank in 18 minutes, taking 360 men with her. Vice Admiral Kurita was forced to abandon his flagship and swim for his life in shark-infested waters before being rescued by destroyer Kishinami. The psychological impact of nearly drowning while his command exploded around him would haunt Kurita's decision-making 48 hours later off Samar. Data's second torpedo spread hit heavy cruiser Takao, blowing off her stern. Though Takao survived, she was crippled and forced to limp back to Brunei, removing 3 ships from Kurita's force. Dace torpedoed heavy cruiser Maya, which exploded and sank in minutes. In the span of 1 hour, American submarines had sunk 2 heavy cruisers, crippled a third, and nearly killed the Japanese commander. The following day, October 24th, brought catastrophe. American carrier aircraft from Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet located Kurita's force transiting the Sibuyan Sea. Wave after wave of dive bombers and torpedo planes attacked throughout the afternoon. The super battleship Musashi became the focus of the assault. Over 4 hours, Musashi absorbed punishment that would have sunk any other warship afloat. American pilots reported hitting her with 19 torpedoes and 17 bomb hits. At 19:35 on October 24th, Musashi capsized and sank, taking over 1,000 men with her. Kurita's force took such punishment that he temporarily reversed course westward around 1500 hours, appearing to retreat. American pilots reported the center force as heavily damaged and retiring from battle. Admiral Halsey, reading these reports aboard his flagship USS New Jersey, made the fateful decision that would leave Leyte Gulf's northern flank exposed. That same evening, Halsey received reports of Ozawa's carrier force approaching from the north. The bait dangled before him proved irresistible. A chance to destroy the remnants of Japan's carrier force could not be ignored. Halsey took his entire Third Fleet, including all 6 of his fast battleships and 8 fleet carriers with their escorts, and raced north at maximum speed. He left no ships to guard the San Bernardino Strait. More critically, he failed to clearly communicate this decision to Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, commander of the 7th Fleet responsible for protecting the Leyte invasion. Halsey had sent a preparatory dispatch about forming Task Force 34, a powerful battleship group, to guard the strait. But this was merely a contingency plan, not an executed order. Through a series of miscommunications and assumptions, Kinkaid believed Task Force 34 had been detached and was guarding San Bernardino Strait. Admiral Chester Nimitz in Pearl Harbor read the same dispatches and made the same assumption. No such force existed. The San Bernardino Strait lay open and completely unguarded. Kurita, having reorganized his battered force after Musashi's loss, reversed course again after nightfall and steamed eastward. At 00:35 on October 25th, his force passed through San Bernardino Strait unopposed. Not a single American ship or aircraft observed the passage. The center force had been reduced but remained formidable. 4 battleships led by Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers now headed south along the eastern coast of Samar Island toward the completely undefended American landing beaches. Between Kurita's overwhelming firepower and General Douglas MacArthur's 130,000 vulnerable troops ashore stood only 3 small task units of escort carriers. These escort carriers, designated by radio call signs Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3, were never designed for surface combat. Built on merchant ship hulls at Kaiser shipyards, they were slow, lightly armed, and unarmored. Their purpose was providing close air support for troops ashore and conducting anti-submarine patrols. The carriers mounted a single 5-inch gun for self-defense and several dozen 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft weapons. Their aircraft carried bombs and rockets meant for Japanese bunkers and trucks, not armor-piercing weapons for naval combat. Taffy 3, the northernmost unit positioned closest to San Bernardino Strait, was commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. The 48-year-old career officer was known as Ziggy to distinguish him from Rear Admiral Thomas Sprague, no relation, commanding Taffy 1 90 miles to the south. Ziggy Sprague's force consisted of 6 Casablanca-class escort carriers. USS Fanshawe Bay served as flagship, USS Streetlow, USS White Plains, USS Kalinin Bay, USS Kitkun Bay, and USS Gambier Bay completed the carrier contingent. Each carrier embarked approximately 28 aircraft divided between FM-2 Wildcat fighters and TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. Screening these carriers were 7 small warships, collectively designated the Small Boys, a term that reflected both their size and their crew's affection for ships designed for unglamorous escort duty. 3 Fletcher-class destroyers provided the heavier punch: USS Johnston, USS Hoel, and USS Heermann. Each displaced 2,100 tons, fully loaded, and carried 5 single 5-inch guns in enclosed turrets. Their main anti-ship weapons were 10 21-inch torpedo tubes carrying Mark 15 torpedoes with 825-pound warheads. 4 John C. Butler-class destroyer escorts completed the screen. USS Samuel B. Roberts, USS Dennis, USS John C. Butler, and USS Raymond displaced only 1,350 tons each and mounted just 2 5-inch guns. They carried 3 torpedo tubes adequate for anti-submarine work but minimal for surface combat. These tiny ships had been designed primarily for convoy escort, not surface combat against battleships whose armor belts were thicker than the destroyer escort's entire hulls. At 6:37 on the morning of October 25, 1944, Ensign William Brooks spotted the approaching Japanese force during his routine anti-submarine patrol. Brooks had launched from Street Low at 6:05 as part of the Combat Air Patrol. His orders were routine: patrol a sector 20 miles north and west of Taffy 3, watch for submarines, and report anything unusual. At 6:37, something very unusual appeared on the northern horizon. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Brooks descended to investigate and radioed his initial report. Ships bearing 240 degrees, estimate 4 battleships, 7 cruisers, 11 destroyers. Rear Admiral Sprague received the initial report with disbelief bordering on irritation. "Some screwy young aviator reporting part of our own forces," he muttered to his staff on Fanshawe Bay's flag bridge. "The identification must be mistaken. Those had to be Admiral Halsey's battleships from Task Force 34. Everyone knew Task Force 34 was guarding San Bernardino Strait. Sprague ordered Brooks to verify his identification. 3 minutes later, at 6:40, Brooks confirmed his sighting with words that made Sprague's blood run cold. "I can see pagoda masts. I see the biggest meatball flag on the biggest battleship I ever saw." There was no mistaking those distinctive pagoda-style superstructures. Those were Japanese battleships, and they were heading directly toward Taffy 3 at high speed. At 6:45, lookouts on the escort carriers spotted anti-aircraft bursts on the northwestern horizon as the Japanese ships engaged Brooks's Lone Avenger. Moments later, colored splashes began erupting around the carriers as Japanese ships opened fire with ranging shots. The Japanese used different colored dyes in their shells to allow spotters to identify which ship was scoring hits. Red, green, yellow, and blue splashes began walking toward the American carriers. One officer later described it as a deadly rainbow advancing across the water. At 6:46, Yamato fired her first salvo from maximum range. The 9 18.1-inch guns hurled 9 tons of steel and explosive toward the small American carriers. Sprague faced an impossible tactical situation with no good options. His carriers could not outrun the Japanese force. Even coaxing 19 knots from engines designed for 18, the carriers would be overtaken within 2 hours at most. His 5-inch guns could not penetrate battleship or cruiser armor. His aircraft were armed for ground support missions with general-purpose bombs and rockets, not armor-piercing bombs or torpedoes. The nearest American heavy ships capable of challenging Kurita belonged to Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's bombardment group 90 miles to the south. Those battleships had just finished annihilating the Japanese southern force in a night battle at Surigao Strait and had depleted most of their armor-piercing ammunition. They could not reach Samar for hours. Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet was 300 miles to the north, pursuing Ozawa's carriers. Even if recalled immediately, Halsey's battleships needed 6 hours to reach Samar. Sprague had perhaps 15 minutes before Japanese shells found their range and began systematically destroying his carriers. Yet, in those minutes, he formulated a response that would become a masterclass in naval tactics against overwhelming odds. First, he ordered all carriers to launch every available aircraft immediately. Pilots scrambled to their planes, some still wearing pajamas. Engines turned over before pre-flight checks were complete. Second, Sprague turned his formation east-southeast toward a rain squall his radar operator had spotted 5 miles ahead. The weather would partially mask his ships and buy precious minutes. Third, he ordered maximum speed from his carriers. Engineering crews pushed boilers beyond their design limits. Fourth, Sprague commanded his escorts to generate smoke. The destroyers and destroyer escorts carried chemical smoke generators that could produce thick artificial fog banks. At 6:50, Sprague transmitted an uncoded radio message on all frequencies. Under attack by Japanese cruiser force of 4 battleships, 7 cruisers at position 11 degrees 46 minutes north, 126 degrees 20 minutes east. Request immediate assistance. The clear text broadcast was received by every American naval unit in the Philippines and triggered immediate panic in multiple headquarters. Admiral Kincaid realized with horror that no American heavy ships protected the northern approach. Admiral Halsey, 300 miles north engaging Ozawa's carriers, received Sprague's call with equal horror, but relief would take hours to arrive. Taffy 3 had only minutes. At 7:01, the first Japanese salvos began landing among the carriers. The scale of the incoming fire defied comprehension for men who had spent the war providing close air support. Yamato's 18.1-inch guns fired shells weighing 3,220 pounds, projectiles heavier than a compact automobile. Heavy cruiser 8-inch guns fired 260-pound shells, designed specifically to gut unarmored targets like escort carriers. Against this onslaught, the carriers' thin steel hulls offered no protection whatsoever. A single large-caliber hit could gut an escort carrier from stem to stern. Sprague's ships zigzagged frantically using a tactic called chasing splashes. Officers directing the ship's maneuvers watched where shells landed and immediately steered toward those spots, gambling that Japanese gunners would not fire twice at the same location. This desperate improvisation actually worked more often than not. Shells that should have struck home instead screamed past bow or stern, missing by yards. But some found their marks. White planes took a direct hit that fortunately failed to explode, the armor-piercing shell passing completely through her thin hull. Kalinin Bay was straddled repeatedly, near misses sending geysers of water cascading across her flight deck. The rain squall provided temporary reprieve at 7:06. For 10 precious minutes, Taffy 3 steamed through torrential rain that reduced visibility to less than 1,000 yards. The Japanese guns fell temporarily silent. Officers and crew used those minutes to organize damage control parties and say prayers. Many men believed they would not survive the next hour, but they remained at their stations, determined to sell their lives dearly. As Taffy 3 emerged from the squall at 7:16, the tactical situation had worsened dramatically. Kurita's force, faster than the American carriers, had closed the range by several miles. Coloured splashes now erupted all around the carriers with frightening accuracy. Sprague made the decision that would define the battle and save his carriers. At 7:16, he ordered the destroyers to conduct a torpedo attack against the Japanese force. Without waiting for detailed instructions, Commander Ernest Evans of USS Johnston had already charged toward the enemy. At 7:10, 6 minutes before receiving Sprague's order, Evans had independently turned Johnston northward and begun his attack run. Evans was Cherokee and Creek descent from Oklahoma, proud of his heritage and fearless to the point of recklessness in combat. At Johnston's commissioning ceremony on October 27, 1943, exactly 1 year and 2 days before the Battle of Samar, Evans had addressed his assembled crew with words that became legendary. "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Not a single sailor requested transfer. Now Evans pointed his ship toward the heart of the Japanese formation and ordered flank speed. Johnston's turbines screamed as she accelerated past 35 knots, racing toward ships that outweighed her 50-1. The range when Johnston began her run was approximately 35,000 yards, over 17 nautical miles. Her torpedoes had an effective range of 10,000 yards, just under 6 miles. To launch, Evans would have to penetrate to point-blank range in naval terms, closing through 17 miles of heavy gunfire. Johnston's crew laid chemical smoke as she charged, generating thick artificial fog that partially obscured her from Japanese optical rangefinders. But smoke could not stop shells. At 7:07, Johnston engaged Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano with her 5-inch guns at maximum range. The Mark 37 fire control director, linked to a computer, gave American destroyers a devastating advantage in gunnery accuracy. While Japanese optical rangefinders struggled with smoke and rain, Johnston's radar painted perfect firing solutions continuously updated in real time. Johnston's shells began hitting Kumano repeatedly. The American destroyer's 54-pound projectiles could not penetrate the cruiser's armored belt, 4 to 5 inches of hardened steel protecting her vitals, but they could devastate her superstructure. Over the next 10 minutes, Johnston fired over 200 main battery rounds at Kumano, an astonishing rate of fire maintained through superbly trained gun crews. At least 45 shells struck the heavy cruiser, starting multiple fires and devastating her bridge and fire control stations. Kumano's topside became a hell of exploding shells and burning metal. At 7:20, having closed to 10,300 yards, Evans launched Johnston's entire spread of 10 torpedoes. One torpedo, possibly two, slammed into Kumano's bow. The explosions tore off the entire front section of the cruiser from the bow to the forward turret. Kumano's speed dropped immediately to 8 knots. She turned away from the battle, escorted by heavy cruiser Suzuya, removing 2 major Japanese units from the fight at the critical opening phase. Johnston had accomplished what seemed impossible. A 2,100-ton destroyer had crippled a 13,000-ton heavy cruiser. But victory came at a terrible and immediate price. At 7:30, as Johnston turned to hide in her own smoke, Yamato fired a full 9-gun salvo at what her fire control station had identified as an American light cruiser. From over 9 nautical miles away, Yamato's rangefinders had acquired Johnston with deadly accuracy. 3 18.1-inch shells struck Johnston almost simultaneously. The first hit below the waterline aft, penetrating the destroyer's unarmored hull as easily as a rifle bullet through paper. The explosion tore into the after-engine room, rupturing steam lines. Scalding steam erupted as 600-degree pressurized vapor flashed seawater into more steam. Men in the engine room died instantly. The second shell struck amidships, destroying Johnston's aft engine completely. Her speed dropped from 35 knots to 17 knots. The third shell hit 2/3 down the ship, severing electrical power to 3 of her 5-gun turrets. Each 18.1-inch projectile carried explosive force beyond comprehension. The shells weighed 3,220 pounds each and contained 73 pounds of explosive. They were designed to penetrate 16 inches of armor plate before detonating inside enemy battleships. Against Johnston's unarmored hull, they punched completely through before their delayed action fuses triggered detonation. This over-penetration actually saved Johnston from immediate destruction. Yamato's secondary battery of 6.1-inch guns fired simultaneously. 3 shells slammed into Johnston's superstructure with devastating effect. The bridge became a slaughterhouse. Commander Evans was blown off his feet, 2 fingers of his left hand severed by steel fragments, his uniform shirt literally torn off his body. Much of his bridge crew was killed instantly. Blood covered every surface on what remained of the bridge. With power lost to 3 gun turrets, steering control severed, engines crippled, and half his bridge crew dead, Johnston should have been finished. Standard naval doctrine dictated that a destroyer suffering such damage should retreat immediately, but Evans was not a standard officer, and Johnston's crew was not a standard crew. Damage control parties worked with desperate efficiency. Within 10 minutes, they had restored electrical power to the 2 forward gun turrets through emergency cables. They had re-established steering control to the emergency station on the fantail. Evans, despite severe wounds and significant blood loss, refused medical treatment beyond minimal field dressing. All medical supplies for wounded crew, he ordered. Evans relocated his command from the shattered bridge to the fantail, where manual steering was now being conducted. He shouted steering orders through an open hatch to sailors manually turning the rudder by hand. Johnston was still in the fight, reduced to 17 knots with 3 of 5 guns out of action. Over the next 2 hours, Johnston would continue fighting, engaging target after target until Japanese shells finally sent her to the bottom. At this critical moment, USS Howell and USS Heermann began their own torpedo runs, followed shortly by the 4 destroyer escorts. The converging attacks created chaos in the Japanese formation. Kurita's ships had been steaming in a formation optimized for speed, not for maneuvering combat. The aggressive American attacks forced them to maneuver independently to avoid torpedoes, breaking up their coordinated fire plans and creating confusion in command and control. USS Howell, commanded by Commander Leon Kintberger, charged directly toward the Japanese battleships. At 7:43, she launched a half-salvo of 5 torpedoes at Battleship Congo from 9,000 yards. The battleship turned hard to starboard to avoid the spread, presenting her narrow bow. At 7:54, Howell fired her remaining 5 torpedoes at heavy cruiser Haguro from under 6,000 yards, terrifyingly close in naval combat terms. At least 1 torpedo struck Haguro in her engineering spaces, forcing the cruiser to reduce speed. But Howell paid a terrible price. Japanese shells began hammering the destroyer. Over the next 45 minutes, Howell absorbed 40 major caliber hits. Her bridge was destroyed, her forward engine room flooded, her No. 2 gun mount was blown off its foundation. All power was lost when her remaining engine room flooded at 8:30. Commander Kintberger ordered abandon ship. Howell rolled over onto her port side and sank stern first at 8:55. Of her crew of 273, only 86 survived. 187 died. USS Heermann, commanded by Commander Amos Hathaway, executed perhaps the most daring single maneuver of the entire battle. At 7:54, she launched her full spread of torpedoes at Battleship Haruna from 4,400 yards, less than 2.5 miles. The torpedoes missed as Haruna turned hard to avoid, but the battleship was forced to turn away from the carriers. Moments later, Heermann found herself trapped between 2 columns of Japanese heavy cruisers. With suicidal courage, Hathaway steered Heermann directly between Battleship Congo and heavy cruiser Chikuma, crossing both ships' bows at point-blank range. The Japanese ships, faced with an American destroyer suddenly appearing between them at ranges of less than 5,000 yards, were forced to turn hard to avoid collision. Heermann escaped the trap, having forced 2 major Japanese units to break off their pursuit. Throughout the battle, Heermann continued engaging targets of opportunity, her 5-inch guns scoring hits on multiple cruisers. The 4 destroyer escorts, designed for anti-submarine warfare and never intended for surface combat against heavy ships, followed the destroyers into battle. At 7:42, Rear Admiral Sprague ordered the Little Wolves to attack. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland of USS Samuel B. Roberts decided to act independently. Samuel B. Roberts was the smallest of the small boys, displacing only 1,350 tons. Copeland had pushed his ship beyond her design limits, dangerously overpressuring her boilers to 660 pounds per square inch, well beyond the design limit of 440. The engineering crew maintained this pressure for over an hour, coaxing 28.7 knots from a ship designed for 24 knots. Before ordering his ship into battle, Copeland addressed his crew over the public address system with words that would become legendary. "This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." The words were matter of fact, not dramatic. Copeland simply stated the tactical reality every man aboard already understood. At 8:10, Samuel B. Roberts launched her 3 torpedoes at heavy cruiser Chokai from approximately 4,000 yards, close enough that her 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft guns could engage Chokai's superstructure directly. One torpedo struck Chokai's stern engineering spaces, causing catastrophic damage to her propulsion system. Combined with a 500-pound bomb hit from aircraft minutes later, Chokai was left dead in the water. Destroyer Fujinami later scuttled the crippled cruiser with torpedoes. Roberts had achieved what her designers never imagined possible. A destroyer escort had mission-killed a heavy cruiser. Roberts then engaged heavy cruiser Chikuma in an extended gun duel at ranges fluctuating between 5,000 and 7,000 yards. Her 2 5-inch guns fired 608 rounds in 35 minutes, a sustained rate of fire of over 17 rounds per minute per gun, astonishing for manually loaded weapons. The aft gun mount was commanded by gunner's mate 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr. Carr's gun crew maintained their incredible rate of fire even after losing electrical power, manually cranking the turret and hand-loading each 54-pound shell. At approximately 8:50, a Japanese 8-inch shell struck the mount, penetrating the thin gun shield and exploding inside. The blast killed, or wounded most of the crew instantly, but Carr, though horribly wounded, refused to abandon his post. At 8:51, disaster struck. A powder charge cooked off in the overheated breech, detonating prematurely. The explosion destroyed the gun mount completely. Carr was caught directly in the blast, suffering catastrophic wounds. When rescue parties reached the mount after the abandoned ship order, they found Carr dying at his station, still holding the mount's final shell, begging with his last breaths for someone to load it so the gun could keep firing. He died moments later. At 8:51, an 8-inch shell from Chikuma penetrated Samuel B. Roberts below the waterline, exploding in the forward engine room. The blast was catastrophic. Steam at 600 degrees scalded men to death instantly. Fuel oil ignited, creating an inferno. Water flooded in through the hole. Most personnel stationed there died within seconds. The ship's main engines and generators were destroyed. At 9:09, a second shell struck near the aft 5-inch mount. At 9:10, with his ship dead in the water, flooding uncontrollably and sinking, Lieutenant Commander Copeland ordered abandon ship. Samuel B. Roberts capsized and sank at approximately 10:05. Of her crew of 224, 89 were killed in action. An additional 25 died from wounds, exposure, or shark attacks during the 2 days survivors spent in the water. The destroyer escorts Dennis, John C. Butler, and Raymond conducted their own attacks, firing their limited torpedo loads at Japanese cruisers. While they scored no confirmed hits, their aggressive actions contributed materially to the chaos, disrupting the Japanese formation. The small boys had accomplished their mission. Through sacrifice and audacity, they had disrupted the Japanese attack, bought time for the carriers, and sunk or damaged multiple enemy ships. But their ordeal was far from over. Throughout these surface actions, American aircraft swarmed over the Japanese ships in continuous attacks. Taffy 3's pilots faced an impossible situation. Their aircraft carried ordnance meant for ground targets. Many Avengers had already expended their torpedoes on pre-dawn strikes. The Wildcat fighters carried machine guns effective against aircraft but useless against battleship armor. Some pilots attacked with depth charges, cylindrical weapons designed to explode underwater near submarines. Against surface ships, depth charges were nearly worthless, but pilots dropped them anyway. Yet the pilots pressed home attack after attack with courage bordering on insanity. Young ensigns and lieutenants, many with fewer than 200 hours of flight time, dove on the most powerful battleships ever built. They made run after run, attacking from different angles, flying through walls of anti-aircraft fire so thick it seemed impossible to penetrate. When their bombs and torpedoes were gone, they made dry runs, diving at Japanese ships without weapons, forcing enemy commanders to maneuver and spoiling their gunnery. The psychological effect on Japanese commanders proved profound. Vice Admiral Kurita, watching wave after wave of aircraft attacking his ships, became convinced he faced fleet carriers, not escort carriers. The ferocity and persistence of the air attacks seemed impossible from small escort carriers. Pilots from Taffy II joined the battle as word spread. Rear Admiral Felix Stump, commanding Taffy II, immediately ordered his squadrons rearmed with heavier weapons. Avengers were loaded with Mark 13 torpedoes and 500-pound general-purpose bombs. Within 30 minutes of Sprague's initial distress call, Taffy II launched strike after strike. Throughout the 90-minute surface battle, Taffy II launched 3 full strikes totaling over 70 sorties against Kurita's force. These attacks proved devastating. The concentrated airstrikes sank 3 Japanese heavy cruisers and damaged others. At approximately 8:20, aircraft from Taffy II hit heavy cruiser Suzuya with a near miss that detonated her starboard-forward torpedo tubes. The Long Lance torpedoes, each carrying 1,080 pounds of high explosive, detonated in a chain reaction. The explosions blew massive holes in Suzuya's hull. Around noon, with fires raging out of control, Suzuya was abandoned. She sank at approximately 13:20. Heavy cruiser Chikuma, already damaged by Samuel B. Roberts's gunfire, was hit by multiple torpedoes from Taffy II aircraft. The torpedoes opened her hull to the sea. Chikuma began sinking slowly, her crew abandoning ship. Destroyer Nowaki took aboard survivors before heading north. Chikuma sank that afternoon. Heavy cruiser Chokai, dead in the water from Roberts's torpedo and the bomb hit to her engine room, was scuttled by Japanese destroyers rather than leave her for American salvage. The escort carriers themselves became direct targets as Japanese ships closed range despite the smoke screens. USS Gambier Bay, positioned on the port flank, fell behind the other carriers. Her engines, stressed beyond their design limits, could not maintain the pace. By 800 hours, Gambier Bay had become isolated, a straggler separated from the protection of the formation. At 8:07, Japanese heavy cruisers Chikuma, Tone, and Haguro concentrated their fire on the struggling carrier. Their 8-inch shells began finding the range. At 8:10, shells hit Gambier Bay's after-flight deck, starting fires. More hits followed in rapid succession. At 8:20, a shell penetrated below the waterline near the forward engine room, causing catastrophic flooding. Gambier Bay lost the use of one engine. Her speed dropped from 18 knots to 11 knots. Johnston, despite her crippled condition, attempted to draw fire away from Gambier Bay. Commander Evans, still commanding from the fantail, ordered his 2 remaining operational guns to engage the Japanese cruisers hammering the carrier. Johnston's shells struck Chikuma and Tone, forcing both cruisers to temporarily shift fire, but 3 cruisers firing from close range could not be deterred for long. Multiple hits struck Gambier Bay's engine spaces, her hangar deck, her hull. Fires raged through the riddled carrier. At 8:40, Gambier Bay was dead in the water, listing heavily to port with fires visible throughout her structure. At 8:50, Captain Walter Vuegg ordered abandon ship. The crew began going over the sides into the warm waters of the Philippine Sea. At 9:07, Gambier Bay capsized to port. At 9:11, USS Gambier Bay sank. From first hit to final sinking, only 61 minutes had elapsed. She was the only American fleet or light carrier sunk by surface gunfire during World War II. Of her crew of approximately 800, 147 were killed immediately or drowned when the ship sank. Many more would die in the water over the following 2 days. The other carriers suffered heavy damage but remained afloat through desperate maneuvering, smoke screens, and the sacrificial attacks of their escorts. USS Kalinin Bay was hit 15 times by shells ranging from 5-inch to 14-inch caliber. One 14-inch armor-piercing shell from Battleship Congo passed completely through the carrier from port to starboard without exploding. Had it exploded, Kalinin Bay would have been destroyed instantly. USS White Plains sustained multiple near misses and at least one direct hit, but her crew kept her engines running. USS Fanshawe Bay, Admiral Sprague's flagship, dodged over 100 near misses through radical maneuvering personally directed by Sprague, de-torpedo attack on the carriers. Despite having only one operational gun turret, one barely functional engine producing perhaps 10 knots, and steering controlled by men manually cranking the rudder, Evans turned Johnston toward the 5 enemy ships. It was suicide, and every man aboard knew it, but the carriers had to be protected. Johnston's remaining forward gun fired as fast as the crew could load, scoring hits on Yahagi with several shells. But Japanese destroyers quickly surrounded Johnston, pounding her with gunfire from point-blank range. Shells from 5-inch guns ripped into the already battered destroyer from multiple directions. At 9:10, with all guns silenced, both engines destroyed, fires raging throughout the ship and the hull listing heavily from uncontrollable flooding, Commander Evans ordered abandon ship. Men began going over the sides, jumping into the warm water and swimming away from the sinking destroyer. At 10:10, USS Johnston rolled over onto her port side and sank rapidly. As she went down, sailors on Japanese destroyer Yukikaze came on deck and stood at attention, saluting the sinking American destroyer in recognition of her crew's extraordinary courage. The gesture, captured in multiple Japanese accounts, reflected the respect Johnston's fight had earned even from her enemies. Commander Ernest Evans was seen abandoning ship, floating in a life jacket, but he was never recovered. Of Johnston's crew of 327 officers and men, only 141 survived. 186 died, either killed in action, drowned when the ship sank, or taken by sharks during the long wait for rescue. At 9:25, after nearly 2.5 hours of continuous combat, something miraculous occurred. The Japanese attack faltered. Vice Admiral Kurita, his command and control disrupted by aggressive American destroyer attacks, continuous airstrikes, and confusion about what forces he actually faced, ordered his scattered ships to reform and regroup. Communications between Japanese ships had broken down during the chaotic running battle. Individual captains had been making independent decisions, chasing whatever target appeared closest. Kurita feared he was facing the main American carrier force with heavy battleships nearby ready to trap his force. At 9:25, he ordered a general retirement to the north to consolidate his scattered fleet. What Kurita did not realize was that he had been on the verge of complete and total victory. The American destroyers were sunk or sinking. The destroyer escorts were out of torpedoes, low on ammunition, and critically damaged. The carriers were nearly out of fuel and ammunition. Gambier Bay was sinking. The others were damaged and slowing. Another 30 minutes of sustained attack would have destroyed Taffy 3 completely and left Leyte Gulf's invasion beaches utterly defenseless against Japanese battleship fire. Instead, Kurita withdrew. The decision remains controversial among historians 8 decades later. Some argue Kurita lost his nerve after nearly drowning when Otago was torpedoed. Others suggest he was simply too cautious, unable to accept casualties in pursuit of a decisive victory. Still others contend his decision was reasonable, given the information available to him. From the American perspective, the withdrawal seemed impossible to believe. Aboard USS Fanshawe Bay, a signalman standing near Admiral Sprague called out words that captured the surreal moment. "God damn it, boys, they're getting away." Officers and crew members stared in disbelief as the massive Japanese battleships and cruisers turned northward and began steaming away from the carriers they had been on the verge of destroying. Sprague himself was incredulous. He had been absolutely certain his entire force would be annihilated. His after-action report filed days later reflected his amazement at the outcome. The success of Taffy 3 was nothing short of special dispensation from the Lord Almighty. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.